Hello, can you all hear me? There we go, wonderful. Hi, welcome. I'm here today to talk to you about injection attacks and the threat that they pose to remote identity verification. We're going to be specifically looking at biometrics, as that is my background. We will be going through exactly why there's a threat, a little bit of detail about how these attacks are generated, what they look like. I will show you some examples as well. We'll also be talking a little bit about the different approaches you can take to mitigating these threats. So my name is Gemma. I'm head of biometric platform at iProve. iProve is a face remote identity provider. My focus is on the biometric systems. So this is all of the components that actually check that the person is who they say they are and are a genuine user. My team focuses both on understanding the threat landscape as well as coordinating and mitigating those threats and deploying those into production. We're going to start a little bit of detail on what exactly an injection attack is and why it poses a threat. I'm going to start with a quote, actually, from the US Department of Homeland Security. Deepfakes and the misuse of synthetic content pose a clear, present, and evolving threat to the public across national security, law enforcement, financial, and societal domains. I think there's really three important parts about this quote. The first is that this is a present threat. This is something that's happening right now against production traffic. This is not a theoretical sci-fi thing of the future. This is a threat now. The second is the fact it's evolving. This is not a threat that is fully understood. The technology is improving day to day, and threat actors are picking up and innovating on their threats. These threat actors are innovative, they are engineers, and they often find new uses for technology that you would never have thought of. The third part is the domains that this applies to. Anywhere where there is remote identity verification, there's a risk. I'm about to show you two photos. I'd like you to take a look at them and then try and work out if you think these are real people or if you think these have been synthetically generated. I'll give you a moment to think and then we'll do a little vote on what you guys think. Okay, we'll start with who thinks that these are real people. Can you raise your hands? Okay, it's probably about 25% of you. Okay, and who thinks that these are fake? Okay, so most of you think these are fake. Actually, that was a trick question. One of these is real and one of them is fake. So we're going to redo that again, and you're going to try and work out which one do you think is the real person. Is it the lady on the left in the black t-shirt or the lady on the right with the white t-shirt? Okay, if you think it's the lady on the left with the black t-shirt, please raise your hands. The real person. We're voting who's the real person. Okay, and if you think the real person is on the right? Okay, so we've got a pretty much 50-50 split there, which tells us everything we need to know, no matter what the answer is. But for your curiosity, lady on the right is the real person. The lady on the left is a synthetic identity, does not actually exist in the real world. This tells us that humans are not very good at telling deepfakes now. Technology has got to the point when it's better than a human at understanding what is a real human and what a human looks like. We did a little study to understand how certain people are that they themselves are amazing at detecting deepfakes, because you should never underestimate how confident people are that they can do this. And it was about 50-50. 50% of the population that we tested thought that they would be able to spot a deepfake. You all were looking for deepfakes, and that was the accuracy we got. Imagine what it's like when you're experiencing these things in the wild and you're not aware that you're looking for a deepfake. We're now going to talk about why this is a threat to identity verification. We're going to use the example of opening a bank account. This is something we're all familiar with, and generally the process includes an identity document and yourself. In an ideal world, you'd provide your identity document and you'd just use your device, and that could be trusted. But we live in a world where people are frauds and we have threats against these systems. And so we've had to implement some solutions to ensure that the person whose document is being provided is the same person who is actually applying for that bank account. So we introduce a step in between the person and the device. This is the camera, which generally is taken in the form of a video, which is then processed either on the device or in the cloud. Now, I will come on to why the cloud part is really important later on. This all looks great, right? You check that the person is who they say they are who they are on the document, until you discover spoofs. Now, I've been at iProof for 7 years, and in that time, I have seen the evolution of these threats. When I first joined iProof, the threat was presentation attacks. The most common kind of attack was someone simply holding up a photo on their phone, trying to authenticate. Or maybe they were holding up their driving license because they misunderstood the process. Those threats also evolved. We started seeing more advanced things like 3D printed heads or synthetic identities held up on screens. But essentially, the extent of which this is a risk is limited because a human actually has to hold this up against the camera. This is not something that can be automated. Also, increasingly over the last few years, this is more of a solved problem. It's not fully solved, but the attack rate and the actual pass rate of those attacks has decreased rapidly over the last few years. The actual threat now is injections. An injection is anything that doesn't go via the camera. There are many different entry points for an injection, but generally it comprises of some sort of injected payload and an entry point. That could be via a virtual camera, or it could be via something like an emulator, where an app actually runs in an environment where the code has been tampered with. It could also mean that actually we bypass the device altogether, and this attack goes directly to the server. So, what do these look like? Now, I mentioned it comprises of a payload and an injection method. We talk about this as what are you injecting and how are you injecting it? Now, these are two vital components for an attacker to get right if they're to have any success of getting an attack through. There are also two aspects that, as a defender against these attacks, we can use to understand if a transaction is genuine. I'd like you to just, for a moment, think like an attacker. Pretend you're that person who is trying to open that bank account in someone else's name. We're going to go through now what your options would be and how would you go about mounting an attack. This is a diagram we like to use to explain the complexity of the different numbers of attacks that are out there. And this is only the high level. This is the major categories. Each of these has innovations and differences depending on the implementation. On the left, we have our traditional presentation attacks. And as we move to the right, we have our entry point at the top, and then also the content of the payload, which is at the bottom here. There are three main categories here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about two of them, which I think are the most important. So the first is the replay attacks. This means that someone takes a genuine transaction that occurred and reuses it at a later date without the consent of that user. That means that the imagery content itself shows no sign of being synthetic because it's not. It is that real person going through that process. The second is the synthetic media. This is the area where we've seen rapid innovation over the last few years. There are different categories. There's our more traditional computer-generated imagery, there's adversarial machine learning, and then also something that you've heard a lot about, deepfakes. There are many different types of deepfakes, and I will be going through face swaps in a little bit and showing you how those work in depth. But please do feel free to learn more about this because there are so many different types, and the breadth and the depth of the innovation in this space has increased the difficulty in defending against these. So there's lots of different kinds of attacks, but how do you know which ones you should be worried about? This is one way you can think about it. The first is to understand the prevalence of that attack. How much are you actually seeing it? Is this something that requires a high skill level and can only be performed by experts? Or is this something where there are toolkits out of the box or things that people can purchase in order to mount this attack? The next is the evolution. We like to talk about this as a bit of an arms race. The attackers are trying to innovate and produce an attack which is more and more likely to succeed. Those defending are also trying to innovate and defend. But the faster an attacker can innovate, the more likely they are to outpace the people defending. The third is the scalability. We mentioned that one of the reasons that presentation attacks are no longer considered the major risk is because the speed of them is quite slow. You have to hold them up. With injection attacks, this can be fully automated, and actually we see bursts of tens, hundreds, or potentially thousands of attempts in a short period of time, much, much faster than a human could ever attack. I mentioned at the beginning that the cloud part is really important, and I'm going to come on to now the first reason why it's important. And it also, you will benefit from this, it's the visibility. We can see what happens. We can see where the threats are, how they're evolving, how these threats are being spread between geographies and between users across different identities. At iProof, we generate a threat report twice a year, which explains the trends that we're seeing. I'm going to show you some graphics from that now and talk a little bit more about it. On the left here, we have our injection attack growth. This is the overall rate of injection attacks that we see. You can see that it's increasing. Between the first half of last year and the second half, 255%. That's a massive increase. But we also see little hotspots of certain techniques growing even faster. Emulators has been the big one for last year. 353% increase last year. Evolution. So part of what makes injection attacks so scary is the sheer number of people who are working on trying to break systems using injection attacks. There are massive communities focused around this with their own chat rooms and conversations. And our analysts are currently tracking over 110 repos and tools just for creating face swaps. Some of these are perfectly innocent. They just like the technology and think it's fun. But a lot of these are nefarious. Or a lot of these are nefarious uses of innocent technology. You can see here that face swaps, which is something I will be showing you in a moment, increased 704% last year. And the main change there is the tooling available. This was technically possible 2 years ago, but what was not possible was for someone without any coding experience to download an app and do this and attack a system without having to have that level of expertise that was required before. I've already mentioned scalability, but I will mention it one more time. This can be scaled to a massive scale, even more than we're currently seeing. And the threat to a system that gets attacked at this rate is very dramatic. The potential losses that any company involved in this could incur are huge. It's really important to be aware that this is not a small problem. Okay, I keep mentioning face swaps. I'm finally going to show you what these actually look like. So face swaps are a type of deepfake that involve having a video of user 1 and then either a photo or video of user 2, and you take the identity of user 2 and you apply that to the video of user 1. I will actually show you an example of this right now, which this is me. This is me doing completely normal face movements that everyone would normally do. The reason I'm doing this is because actually some of these actions I'm doing with my face are things that certain authentication processes require. I just wanted to show you that these are easily applied in a deepfake. So you can see I'm no longer me, but it's still my background, still my lighting, still my facial expressions. I'm just going to let you enjoy this for a moment. It looks pretty real, right? Okay, enough of that. And if anyone wants to try this themselves, we do actually have a setup on our booth. So come to 2606 if you want to try this yourself and see yourself looking like this. So come and see us after. Okay, we've spoken a little bit about what the technology looks like, but now I want to talk about how an attacker thinks, how they would actually attack a system. I'm aware there's a lot of text on the screen right now. I will talk us all through it, don't worry. Okay, first, an attacker will pick a target. We're going to go back to our banking example. Maybe there's a bank which is offering a reward for signing up, a cash reward. This is a great target for an attacker because there's an immediate economic benefit of breaking that technology. Once they've identified that there's something they want to break, the next is understanding what is defending it, what kind of verification technologies is behind it. There may be some which they're aware they can break, or some which they have a feeling they can, and some which they know not to touch. And if it's one that they know not to touch because it's difficult to break, they'll go try something easier. There are lots of things that they could be doing out there. They're going to pick the things that give themselves the best benefit for that effort. Once they understand kind of how the technology works and they've identified who the identity provider is, they start doing research. They start talking to their friends online and work out if anyone's got a solution. Sometimes people will just give these away for free. Sometimes these are sold as full packages. Once they have a technique, they start to experiment with tools. So they'll start downloading tools and providing a solution which kind of looks like what they expect the data for that particular identity process to include. They might include raising the eyebrows or nodding their head, for example. This might also be paired with document forgery. Often in a process, you need to actually match your face to a document. So this could be combined with organized crime and theft of documents, or it could be forged documents. Once they have their content ready, their what they want to inject ready, they need to work on how to get into the system, what their entry point is. They might try things like emulators or virtual cams. Once they have their solution lined up, now it's time for them to experiment and try it. Now, this often requires a long process of optimizing the configuration to get as close as possible to be as likely as possible to pass. I mentioned the cloud thing and why it's important. Well, we can actually see threat actors going through this process, iterating and trying to get closer. It allows us to really understand where they're going to end up before they end up there and fix the problems that they might encounter before they end up there. Okay, so how can we actually defend ourselves against this? I mean, the short answer is use the technology which the attackers are using. Machine learning has massively grown and improved over the last few years, and that has been used to create deepfakes which can be used to attack verification systems. But we can also use those same technologies to defend. Use machine learning, use data-driven approaches. Don't use humans because they're really bad at spotting deepfakes. There are two main types I'm going to be talking about now. The first is metadata-based approaches. So this is something that sits with information that's provided by the device. It could be information about whether the phone is jailbroken or if it's reacting in a way which is indicative of an emulator. The second is the imagery-based approach. This is actually processing the video that has been provided to look for evidence that it's synthetic. These can also be used together. So the metadata one is reliant on information from the device. And given that our default is to not trust the device, we have to take this one with a bit of a pinch of salt. It relies on obfuscation of the code on the device, which, as we know, is not a reliable process in any way. And once an attacker understands what a genuine payload of metadata looks like, they can spread that information to their friends. This can be perfectly forged and replicated and used over and over again. With the imagery-based approaches, it's about understanding whether the imagery comes from a genuine user. It's about understanding what synthetic data looks like and trying to detect that. When done well, imagery-based methods can provide a solution that's hard to synthesize. I will be coming on in a moment to how you can make your data hard to synthesize and how you can make it more unique. We'll come on to that in a minute. But part of it is making sure it's not repeatable, so you can't use a previous transaction again. When done well, this means that you end up with a payload which cannot be perfectly forged. Okay, I'm now going to talk about usable security. because we do want this to be usable still. We want genuine people to be able to pass. And this poses a few challenges. I'm going to define a few terms first, just because these are used a bit weirdly across our industry in different ways. So we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Active requires user action. This means you tell the users to do something, and they follow those instructions and they do it. Passive, they don't have to do anything. The second part is the repeatability part. So can a transaction be used again? Is the imagery from one transaction distinct enough from the imagery of another transaction that you can tell that it is unique to this instance now? Now, these two axes can be plotted on a nice little 2x2 grid here. On the bottom row, we have user action required. Top is no user action. Left is repeatable signal. Right is unique signal. I'm going to give you some examples to illustrate what I mean here and kind of go through the pros and cons. A user action required, but predictable, means it's the same user action required each time. This could be you want the user to blink or turn their head. You can also have a no user action required. This is just a video or a photo. Then on the right-hand side, with the non-repeated biometric signal, if you're asking a user to do something, that has to be unique to that transaction. So that could be something like asking them to read out a sequence of letters or numbers or move through a sequence of facial expressions. Generally, this means that users are not able to follow those instructions and you have a high dropout. There are also concerns with accessibility here as well, as certain people are less able to follow those instructions, especially when you're being forced to contort your face in new, weird, wonderful ways. Because as attackers get better at mimicking those actions, you saw that deepfake, I could move my face around just like a real person. As those actions get more complicated, it becomes harder for genuine users to fulfill them, but really no harder for someone generating a deepfake. On the top right, we have kind of the golden zone. These are unpredictable, unique biometric signals that don't require the user to follow any instructions. The way we do this at iProve is we flash a sequence of colors at the face of the user by showing them on the screen. And we look at the way that screen reflects off of the face. So in our video is a person with a sequence of colors flashing on their face. That sequence is unique every time, and so we know that transaction is occurring right now and it's not a previously used transaction. This provides a highly usable and highly secure system. People often talk about the balance between usability and security, but that's really kind of a myth. You can have a very unusable, insecure system, and you can also have a very usable, very secure system. I said I would talk a bit more about the cloud stuff. Here's another example of why it's really important. We've spoken a bit about how attackers evolve their systems. They're innovative, they're creative, they come up with new approaches. This means that those defending also need to be just as innovative and just as able to deploy those improvements. One of the things that we do with the threat intel that we get, as well as providing wonderful reports for everyone to read, is we actually use that information to understand what is going on. We have alerts in our production platform which highlights any particularly weird transaction that can be manually reviewed. This allows us to understand what are the novel kinds of attacks, where are people moving, how are they innovating, what do future attacks look like. We'll then triage that, try to understand that attack. We have a red team as well who will try and replicate that and attack us in the same way to understand how big a threat this is. We then build defenses, whether that's reconfiguring an existing system, retraining of a machine learning algorithm, or potentially building a whole new component. Those defenses then get tested by the same red team, and we also do some thorough analysis to understand the performance of that module. We also do thorough bias testing, because you don't want to be introducing bias into your system with security updates. Once everyone's happy with that component, we can automatically deploy that across the world to all of our customers without requiring SDK updates or customers to update their apps. We all know Customers are terrible at updating their apps. How many of you have out-of-date apps on your phone right now? It's not a great way of introducing new security features. It's much better to be able to do that independently. So this is our feedback cycle. This is our evolution of our system. And you need to make sure you can evolve, because the threat actors definitely are. Thank you very much. I think we're going to be opening for questions. Does anyone have a question for me? Everyone's very quiet.
Thank you, great presentation. Question on the, I think you mentioned the sequence of colors, like that through light you would figure out whether it is A, light, and genuine. What about the lighting around the user and the screen size?
Yes, so the screen size and the ambient lighting are all considerations that we have to take into account. And we actually do a lot on the app to make sure that we get the user into a good position so they can start the transaction to maximize their chances. But in reality, you don't need much of a signal to be able to tell that sequence of colors. And so unless you're in really, really bright direct sunlight and you're trying to maximize the amount of light on your face, we will be able to detect that sequence. Yes, question over there.
So in the quad you showed, is there any of those that would benefit the most from comparison against authoritative records?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand the question now.
So for introduced records comparison for document forgery,
Mm-hmm.
which one of those four would receive the best?
Yeah, so all the techniques can be used alongside comparing to a document. So this is the anti-spoofing component of that, but there's also the matching. And really, it doesn't matter which approach you take, so long as you've got a clear image of that face and you've confirmed that clear image is the same user that you are authenticating the genuineness of. So really, it doesn't matter which of those you're using. You should be using the best quadrant, whether you're using a document or not.
So, if you look at in a holistic, just the biometric itself, once you have figured out to outpace the defenses, isn't it pretty explosive at the moment where once you have figured out a technique you can do attack on anybody versus a password-based system where if you have figured out a password for I'm the only one, or there are a few set of people who are only one who are in the attack vector versus this.
So you're saying if you guess a password, you can only get into that account, whereas if you break something here, you can get into everyone's. That is true, but it's also a lot easier to guess a password than it is to generate a synthetic attack.
I expect this is used more for identity verification purposes most of the time, your service.
Yeah, so it's used for identity verification as well as ongoing authentication. That is usually for things like step-up authentication if someone needs to rebind to a device, for example.
My question is, if for instance, with the identity verification use case, do you see more of workforce implementations using it, or do you see more of customer identity for using it?
Sorry, what do you mean then?
For the identity verification use case, do you see more of the internal, workforce when they're first being created? Do you see them doing the verification for the first time, or is it more used in the customer identity implementation?
So we see the same approaches against particular customer identity programs as well as across the board. So one of the things that we can do with having visibility is see that spread. And we might see that someone tries a certain technique against one client and then somehow they're like, oh, I know this company. I'm going to use a different SDK or app or whatever they're using and try and attack elsewhere as well. So maybe if they try against one bank, they will also try against others as well.
Actually, two questions if you don't mind.
You go for it.
What's the cost per transaction compared to other identity proofing products? And do you have, and how does the user impact like epileptic users or people sensitive to light?
Yeah, So I'll answer the second question first. So on the sensitivity to light, this is something we had tested, and the flashing has to be below a certain speed in order to not trigger epilepsy. So we have been very careful with that, and that has been tested, yeah. And so your other question?
Cost of transaction compared to your competitors.
I'm not in sales or marketing, so please do talk to the sales team at the booth for that. I just build the tech. Yeah, so we started with faces, and that is where we've historically had our main products, but we also currently have trials going with both fingerprint and palm, and that is something we are extending into as well. We're aware that things like fingerprints, because governments often have them on records, can be a useful thing to have. Yeah.
Do you save any information for the biometric match?
Yeah, so the question there was, do you save the biometric information? It depends on the implementation. For certain cases where we're expecting that user to return and authenticate in the future, we need to keep certain biometric data because otherwise we won't be able to match them when they come back. In other cases, it might be 30 days because we need to be able to provide evidence of fraud if there's some sort of compliance reason to do so. For some, it has to be deleted within 24 hours. Some, it's instantaneous. It really depends on the implementation.
Assuming that the transaction starts and then you know that for each transaction you're going to show a different sequence of colors on the screen, why can't that video be deepfaked? Why can't there be a technology where once you start a transaction and you know that there's a unique sequence of colors you're going to show, and then actually produce a video which...
Yeah, so it makes it harder because an attacker can't prepare ahead of time a deepfake with the correct sequence because they don't know what that sequence is going to be. And actually the sort of time limitations currently are just about outpacing the technology of deepfakes in terms of how quickly they can generate a highly realistic looking deepfake. You can generate a really, really good deepfake if you have GPUs and some time. Doing it real time, the quality does go down, and that introduces other artifacts that different systems can detect.
So your clock starts when the transaction starts, and then you have to do it within like that time period to produce that.
We have timeouts in place, yeah. The false positive rate depends what kind of attack you're doing. It's quite funny when people quote these false positive rates. What do you actually mean? Do you mean of people holding up a photo or doing a really basic deepfake? You've probably all seen some deepfakes out there which are like, I can actually tell that's a deepfake. Or do you mean one where genuinely people can't tell? And so it's actually really hard to give a single number on that. What we try and do, we also have two different products with different security levels. We try and make sure on a lower security level, for any specific type of attack, it's less than 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000 for our higher security level. We don't do retinal. That's one which we don't do, unfortunately. So if you want to know why, I'm sure our CEO, Andrew Budd, is happy to talk to you about it. I know he has some opinions on this one.
Do you have a repository of known faces for bad actors?
So that is a very good question. People tend to use the same actors, as in like Hollywood actors, all the time for attacks. You have to be a bit careful, because what if that person genuinely tried to use your system? So you have to be a bit careful there about how widely you stop that identity from being used. But we do track identities. Yep, one at the back. Sorry, what laws? I couldn't quite hear the first bit. I'm not sure about that. I don't know about that one. I'll talk to you about that afterwards.
That's a deal with that as well. And California is coming up with updates laws on biometrics to do hacking on data specifically with holding on to users.
Yeah, so consent is really important in this. We make sure that all of our users are aware they're going through the process. I mean, the flashing colors aren't exactly subtle. People do realize what's going on. And we do make sure that we follow all data deletion policies and we work with our customers to make sure that we are acting with the best interests of the client at heart. I think that's all the questions from everyone. Wonderful. Thank you very much for listening.